I really want to welcome our faculty collaborator today, Dr. Paula Parks. She is the coordinator for ASTEP Umoja Community Program and professor of English at BC. And most recently, most notably, I've had the pleasure of knowing that she was inducted into the Cal State University Bakersfield Hall of Fame. So Dr. Parks, thank you so much for your collaboration today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. As a professor here, as the Umoja coordinator, and as an advocate for social justice, it is my pleasure to introduce Justin Hansford. He is the executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, which is at Howard University School of Law, and he's a professor at the Howard University School of Law, where he also earned his bachelor's at Howard. And how appropriate that he attended an HBCU, because this afternoon at 3 o'clock, the Umoja community is having a presentation on HBCUs and how easy it is for community college students in California to transfer. And also, I have a personal connection to Howard Law School. In 1948, my dad graduated from Howard Law, and then my daughter also went there. She graduated in 2014. And I asked her, did she know Professor Hansford? And she said, no, he must not have been there in 2014. And upon further research, he was not there in 2014, but I'll get to where he was in 2014. He got his JD from Georgetown, where he was founder of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. He was a Democracy Project Fellow at Harvard, visiting professor of law at Georgetown Law Center, and associate professor of law at St. Louis University. And that's where he was in 2014 when Michael Brown was murdered by Darren Wilson in Ferguson. And at the time, he was living 10 miles from Ferguson. And he wrote in a New York Times opinion piece, something in my heart told me I needed to join the protests and fight for what was right. And he worked to empower the Ferguson community, and he also co-authored the Ferguson to Geneva Human Rights Shadow Report and accompanied the protesters and the Brown family to Geneva, Switzerland to testify at the United Nations, where Michael Brown's mother had the opportunity to have her voice heard. So that's where he was supposed to be in 2014, and he was. Professor Hansford is a leading scholar and activist in critical race theory, human rights, and law and social movements. He is published in numerous academic journals and co-author of an upcoming book, the 7th edition, Race, Racism, and American Law. I am so honored to present and later to moderate a discussion with Professor Hansford.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parks. And that was a wonderful introduction, and I'm so glad to hear about your daughter. And we have to talk more about some of your Howard connections. And I would like to thank the Student Government Association of Bakersfield College for inviting me. I'm very honored to be able to participate in this discussion today. I do hope that we have a robust discussion after my short presentation so that I can hear more about your ideas on these important issues of the day. I'm going to share my screen in a moment and begin my presentation on the subject of free speech and race here in the 21st century. All right, can everybody see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the thing about jail is there's nothing to do. The novelty wears off after about 5 minutes. My cell was about 10 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a toilet, a faucet, and a sink. On the right was a metal bunk bed, and everything was made of cold metal. The mattress was thin and hard and worn and musky. I'd been arrested earlier that day at a Walmart in Maplewood, Missouri, just a few miles outside of Ferguson. Up until then, I had never even seen the inside of a jail cell, not even for a field trip. At the protest, I had worn a neon green hat labeled with the words "Legal Observer," and I had my phone on record mode, thinking that I could serve as a legal observer and a bystander to this protest. Shortly after the police arrived at the Walmart, the manager closed the store, even though the store was a 24-hour Walmart. Simply by standing in the store after it was closed, we became trespassers in the eyes of the law. And immediately a police officer came up behind me, jerked my arms behind my back, handcuffed me. And when I asked, "What did I do?" the officer replied, "Shut up." He then shoved me out of the store headfirst into a squad car, the metal handcuffs pinching my wrists. There were other legal observers also standing next to me in the store, 5 legal observers in total. 4 were white, 1 was Asian, and myself. I was the only Black one, and I was the only one that was arrested. I sat inside the squad car, bent sideways and sitting on one leg as the protesters outside continued to chant. And the entire time, the legal observer hat, the neon green legal observer hat that was supposed to serve as my armor against arrest, had fallen off and was lost. After this incident, I became much more interested in the question of surrounding freedom of speech in the First Amendment, specifically as it relates to the rights of protesters, for obvious reasons. Free speech controversies in the age of Black Lives Matter, whether in the realm of protest, education, hate speech, or in other areas, continue to frustrate social justice advocates. Many struggle to conceptualize the issue in critical ways that go beyond the liberal bromides that profess the necessity of free speech absolutism, and warn that even the most harmful, hateful speech activity must be allowed, or else we will go down a slippery slope that will result in a dystopian level of suppression of ideas. This was especially the case as we, just over a year ago, witnessed a huge disparity in the way that Black Lives Matter protesters were treated as opposed to those who entered the Capitol on January 6th. This event has demonstrated that, to the contrary, extreme speech suppression, such as that I experienced, is already here. The banning of protests, books, and postings on social media have already been implemented, with the caveat that subordinated racial groups have borne the brunt of the speech suppression, and the lectures reminding them why speech suppression itself is undesirable when other speech is allowed. So using the conceptual tools of critical race theory, I would like to talk today about my experiences in the area of protests, free speech, hate speech, and the First Amendment, trying to uncover and understand how the conceptual limits of liberalism have paralyzed many of us that try to advocate for social justice, keeping us in a conundrum where we, on one side, fear any suppression of expression of ideas while consistently observing the suppression of racial justice ideas and the resistance to the suppression of ideas that have supported the big lie and other anti-racial justice concepts. So I want to speak about this issue from the perspective of a lawyer, as an attorney who is committed to the First Amendment. Here's the language of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Beautiful language, and no mention of race, no mention of inequality. So I know many people may ask the question, when I wrote this law review article in the Yale Law Review, arguing that the First Amendment has been articulated as a racial project, what did I mean by that? And how are these ideas help us to understand the way that the First Amendment has played out over the past couple of years when it comes to questions of free speech? Well, if you look at the history of our free speech debates, so often we have seen that mass protests in support of civil rights and racial justice have served as not just the platform, but the basis for many of the most important legal decisions that have helped to determine the outlines of our free speech jurisprudence. Derek Bell, who's one of the founders of critical race theory, spoke about the dilemma that many protesters during the civil rights movement faced, wherein many of the protests that were given license by state authorities in Alabama or Mississippi were protests that made little to no impact in the civil rights movement. Oftentimes, it was the unlawful protests that made the most impact. And this tradition that we see of unlawful protesting being ultimately, and I'm going to come to this in a second, ultimately, in many cases in this 1960s, in some way, shape, or form, protected by the courts. This tradition, Professor Bell sought to explain with his very groundbreaking concept called interest convergence. As you see here, many cases involving protests in Alabama and Virginia and Louisiana and other states around the country were cases in which civil rights protesters arrested and sometimes beaten and convicted in the lower courts for seeking to integrate lunch counters and seeking to integrate bus terminals, which is what took place in some of these cases, seeking to protest on public property. Many of these cases were cases in which the courts overturned those convictions. Sometimes this happened, of course, in the shadow of Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 case in which the court established that the principle of separate but equal should not be upheld in the United States any longer. Segregation was no longer the law of the land. So these protests in the 1958 protests of the NAACP, 1960 sit-in protests in Virginia, and other protests were upheld by the courts. And as Professor Bell sought to explain why that was the case, he relied on a principle called interest convergence. The principle of interest convergence provides that the interests of Blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated in certain instances by the broader society. However, that accommodation will only happen when that racial remedy converges with the interests of whites. And in his most famous example of that, Professor Bell argued in 1980 that Brown versus Board of Education itself was an example of interest convergence. Because of the international geopolitical dynamics at the time, of course, ironically, given the day's events, the Cold War and the the interactions between the United States and Russia were at issue during that time period. But during that time, because of the geopolitical dynamics of the day, it was in the interest of the United States to project a global image that seemed to suggest that racism was going to be fought on the United States soil and segregation was going to be ended. So the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 in the eyes of Derek Bell was more so a principle of interest convergence playing itself out, less an instance of beneficence in the eyes and the actions of the United States Supreme Court. Similarly, in my scholarship, I argue that many of the cases that we saw in the 50s and 60s, where courts defended civil rights protesters, also were cases that built on that same interest convergence. We saw that as long as protesters were seeking to implement the court's ruling of Brown versus Board of Education, the court found ways to uphold the actions of the civil rights protesters and overturn their convictions for protests. This trend ended immediately in 1966 when the protests shifted from less of a push to end segregation and more of a push after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act had already been passed in 1965 and 1964 respectively, more so a push for what was then called Black Power. So I talk about in the article how in a case like Adderley versus Florida, when protesters were fighting for the end of police brutality practices, those convictions of those protesters were not overturned. And of course, in 1967, in Walker versus City of Birmingham, we saw a case in which Martin Luther King himself had to see his protest arrest and conviction upheld by the Supreme Court. In that case, Dr. King had explained some of his philosophies around his decision to engage in protests, even when they were unlawful. Famously, in his letter from Birmingham jail, which he wrote while behind bars, comparing just and unjust laws, making the argument that it is sometimes right to break the law when the law itself is morally wrong. These types of theoretical questions are questions that many protesters have continued to grapple with over the years, including protesters who went on to become scholars, like Professor Derek Bell, who himself was a member of the NAACP and a protester. So these are some of the theoretical questions that we continue to talk about in our scholarship as critical race theorists, and I would love to talk about this later on if anyone is interested. Some commentators are troubled by the principle of being willing to break unjust laws that Dr. King articulated. Harvard professor Charles Freed famously argued that this is a slippery slope, and once someone is able to determine by themselves that certain laws are just or unjust, we are on a slippery slope to unlawfulness as a society. Dr. King had also argued that the breaking of unjust laws was only justifiable when that lawbreaker decides to willingly submit themselves to arrest after that instance of lawbreaking. But that is also a debatable principle that others, including Howard Zinn, have argued is a self-defeating principle. And so coming back again to this question of the First Amendment, we've thought about the lawful protester's dilemma, the distinction between just and unjust laws, and the questions around the justness of civil disobedience. I also want to talk a little bit about the First Amendment in the context of hate speech. Because one of the things that is so interesting about the First Amendment is that although it also applies to freedom of assembly, the freedom of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, it's also a principle that is invoked oftentimes to seek to limit people's exposure to hate speech, whether it's on a college campus or in broader society, as we saw in Charlottesville in 2017. The court, however, has said the First Amendment does not allow for the regulation of speech based on its content. And I don't want to go into too many details, from a technical legal sense, but essentially the court has said that it applies a standard called strict scrutiny, the most exacting standard available whenever a regulation seeks to limit speech based on its content. There are many exceptions to this. The court does allow the limitation of speech based on its content when it's libel or defamation or copyright or perjury, but not when it comes to hate speech. Now, this was not always the case. In 1952, the court had a hate speech case in which it articulated its understanding that there are certain instances of hate speech that can be made to be seen as analogous to libel, and we could even use the term group libel for that idea of hate speech as group libel, being in an instance of making a libelous remark about a group based on their race. With the understanding in 1952, in the aftermath of World War II, with the understanding in 1952 that for us to deny that a person's job and educational opportunities and the dignity accorded to that person may depend as much on the reputation of the racial and religious group to which the person willy-nilly belongs is errant dogmatism. So understanding that just as a person can be harmed by individual libel, people also can be harmed by group libel. And courts have continued to battle over that question over the subsequent half century, ultimately coming to a conclusion that for now, hate speech is not being regulated in general by the Supreme Court. But it was another critical race theorist, Mari Matsuda, and her husband, Charles Lawrence, who wrote in a landmark book called Words That Wound, that there should be more aggressive regulation of hate speech for many reasons, not only because of the harm that the words do themselves, but also because of the impact that hate speech has on the promulgation of hate crime. I've included here some of the more recent statistics from the Department of Justice showing the prevalence of hate crime convictions in the United States. However, I do want to note that the Justice Department has also articulated that only about 1/4 of hate crimes are actually prosecuted by prosecutors and courts and judges. So hate crime statistics have been found to be many, many times higher than these statistics for convictions. In one Justice Department survey, it was thought to have been proven that over 250,000 instances of hate crime take place in the United States every year. 200 and 250,000 instances take place every year, and only a small amount are prosecuted. As we saw with the conviction of the killers of Ahmaud Arbery earlier this week, when those hate crimes are prosecuted and convictions are obtained, it does allow for there to be a certain level of discussion around hate crime, and a message is often sent to the community that these types of incidents will not be tolerated. So that's why I want to talk a little bit about those issues, because those are some of the issues I'm thinking about right now in terms of the First Amendment. And these issues have not been limited to protest and hate crime here in the age of Black Lives Matter. Those are two questions that are central, but there's a third question, and that is the rise of laws against protests and laws against the discussion of critical race theory. And I want to talk about these two contemporary dilemmas and problems, and really we could even use the word crises, because right now when we talk about free speech and hate speech, one of the primary ways that we engage in speech that is relevant to issues of racial justice is using the platform of the classroom and using the platform of the streets. And we've seen coordinated attacks. And if you look at these maps, you will see that the states that have decided to crack down on protests through anti-protest laws that include laws which make it is in some way, shape, or form less punishable to run over a protester if they are blocking the street, laws that make it so that a protester who is arrested for a protest crime cannot apply for student aid at a college, financial aid at college. All of these different types of laws have been passed in states that, if you look at this map, also are passing laws suppressing the teaching of critical race theory. If you look at these two maps, you'll see the almost eerie alignment of these two different attempts to squelch speech that is racial justice speech, to squelch speech that is the speech of Black and brown populations, to squelch First Amendment activity, free speech, so that these types of discussions do not happen in our societies. So I want us to take away some of the key ideas from this talk. And I'm looking forward to having an open discussion with you on these ideas. But I do want to acknowledge that these ideas that I talked to you about today, I learned from my study of critical race theory. My desire to be a scholar on the First Amendment, I learned, and I was inspired by my experience as a protester. So in these places where they are seeking to take away our ability to learn critical race theory, where they are seeking to dissuade us and persuade us and to stop us from taking to the streets to voice our opinion in lawful assemblies, we are seeing the systematic denial of inspiration and education and edification for our communities. And I think that if I was to end my talk today with a call to action, I call on you to continue to defend your right to teach the truth, continue to defend your right to demonstrate in support of justice, and continue to do the work that you're doing here at Bakersfield College to make this world a better place. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to a very robust conversation with you all.
Great, great, great. And thank you very much. I appreciate those comments. And there have been some questions. And so I'm going to start with the one on critical race theory that you mentioned. And would you give a very simple definition of what it is first?
Okay, sure. So critical race theory. So it's much discussed, very rarely fully understood. Critical race theory is a scholarly legal inquiry that asks how and why these gaping racial inequalities that we see in our society today, many decades after the civil rights movement, we ask how and why these disparities continue to exist in our nation. So it's a way of unearthing and understanding structural and legal and economic and political racial inequality in the United States and our institutions.
Okay. You mentioned that it was scholarly and legal, but some of the places it's been banned has been in K through 12. Is this normally something that's taught in elementary, junior high, and high school?
Well, so critical race theory originated in law schools. There, over time, some teachers have tried to take some of those ideas and teach them in lower levels of our education system. I'll tell you this though, I teach critical race theory right now at Howard Law School, and it's not an easy set of ideas to understand for law students. I know there are very few kindergartners who understand critical race theory, but I think that what is happening is that in many of these states, politicians are attempting to ban teachers from discussing concepts like racism in any way, shape, or form. And they're calling the banning of that discussion of racism or discussion of inequality a critical race theory ban. So it's a very interesting dynamic that's taking place. So in many of those situations, no, it is not critical race theory that is being banned. It is actually the teaching of anything that has to do with racism at all. And sometimes, you know, we're seeing the banning of books by Maya Angelou, and sometimes it just seems like they're banning anything that has a person of color or a Black person's face on it. And they're doing that ban, they're enforcing that ban on the grounds of using the term critical race theory to do so. So it's a very interesting dynamic that's taking place right now. Well, in most cases, critical race theory is not being taught in K through 12 schools, but what they are teaching is important to keep if they're teaching something that involves racial injustice, and also if they're teaching anything that allows people to gain insight into different elements of human life and the views and the lenses of people of color throughout our society.
What are some ways to talk about and teach race? So I know some people perhaps have wanted to ban it because of feelings of maybe feeling guilty, and I know that's not the purpose of it, but what are some ways to have conversations around race and racism?
Well, critical race theory is not the idea that racism is inherent in any human being. And the better way to talk about race and racism is to talk about it as a systemic structural phenomena and a historical phenomena that is socially constructed and at the same time is continuously present and acting in real ways in our world when it comes to issues of economics, issues of property, issues of housing, issues of education. Of course, we're seeing what's happening when it comes to the criminal justice system and policing. And so I think that to me, the best way to talk about these issues is to understand how these issues from an institutional sense are not just inherited from previous generations, but also are continuously recreated. When you talk about immigration in the United States, you're talking about race. When you're talking about crime in the United States, oftentimes law and order discussions are discussions about race. So oftentimes we, welfare, and giving in healthcare and all these other issues have racial variance to them. So I think that one of the better ways to talk about race, in my view, is to acknowledge and accept and recognize and discuss the inherent racial dynamics in everyday conversations. To have a talk about immigration and borders and to act like race is not relevant to the political positions that people are taking. It's more than just worried about making people feel uncomfortable. What you're doing in that situation is you're having an incomplete discussion about the immigration question. To talk about crime and law and order in the United States and not to talk about race at all, you're just having an incomplete discussion about crime in the United States if you leave race out of it. So to me, that the best way to understand and discuss race to me is to see it as part and parcel of American politics and American questions of justice and American institutions.
I think a lot of people may not feel that they have the background or the comfort to have those kinds of discussions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that's why you need to study critical race theory. You know, the information is information that is objective, scientific. Scholars have researched it. Scholars have disagreements on issues, just like in any other field. And it does take some time to be exposed to the right types of research. Luckily, Dr. Parks, they have you to lead them in the right direction, and other scholars on your campus who can lead them in the right direction. So I don't think it is an excuse. I know that, for example, just an analogy. Right now, we see what's happening around the world in terms of COVID. We see what's happening around the world in terms of what's happening in Russia. I'm not a doctor. I'm not someone who knows about what's happening in Europe, but it's not correct to simply ignore those crises in our society because you don't have an expertise in health or European politics. These are things that affect our world, and so it's our responsibility as educators to make sure that we find a way to introduce our students to the topic so that they can be conversant in these things that will affect their lives.
You talked about anti-protest laws and how they overlap with the banning of critical race theory. Mm-hmm. And you also showed the increase in hate crimes. In the New York Times piece that I read, you also talked about the issue of backlash. Mm-hmm. Can all of that be grouped together? And if so, how?
It can be grouped together. So historically, we have found that there's a pattern when it comes to the historical trajectory of racial reform, and that pattern is called reform and retrenchment. So Professor Kimberly Crenshaw has talked about this as well. So we saw the reform and the victory of the abolition of enslavement, and then you had Reconstruction, and then of course we see Jim Crow, and we take backward steps. During the Reconstruction era, you had Black elected officials in the South. You had the founding of Black universities, but then during Jim Crow, we saw segregation implemented. Then you had the Civil Rights Movement, more forward progress during the Civil Rights Movement, and then you see the end of affirmative action right away in the implementation of mass incarceration in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. There's our history of racial reform has been not a straight trajectory going up, up, and up. It's always been a trajectory of reform, then retrenchment, reform, then retrenchment. So for many people who may have been really excited, myself included, to see this racial reckoning, so to speak, in 2020, and we saw some very amazing things take place. The creation of the Juneteenth federal holiday, so many different institutions providing contributions to historically Black colleges and universities, and so there's so many positive things happening. We are seeing this response as retrenchment, and so I think people, to be clear, they should understand that the push against critical race theory is not happening haphazardly. It is a very specific response to what happened in 2020 and the racial reckoning, and it is the retrenchment Van Jones called it the white lash. It's a retrenchment project that has a lot of historical resonance throughout American history. Whenever we see forward steps, we've seen backward steps following close behind.
And what suggestions do you have? What can we do? How can we support a movement? How can we make a difference?
Well, I'll say this. There are a number of things that are happening around the country on the question of teaching the truth. There have been efforts recently in Texas, for example, to have a conversation around the freedom, academic freedom of professors to, I guess the phrase is keep your laws off our syllabi and to be able to teach issues of race and inequality at the University of Texas in particular. The faculty there passed a resolution affirming that they have the right to autonomy over their curriculum, and they have the right to teach about racial and gender justice and injustice in their curriculum. And some schools have even gone so far as to mandate the teaching of civil rights and racial justice and gender justice at their university, recognizing the importance of that issue and affirming that every student at their university, at their college, does need to have that background. The American Bar Association, I can tell you from the legal perspective, the American Bar Association just a week ago passed a resolution saying that every law school in the country has to teach some sort of issue around equity, class around equity or inclusion on some level. So in response to the push to ban the teaching of inclusion and equity and the truth, many schools around the country are not only affirming their academic freedom, but they are actually mandating, so taking a forward step and mandating the need to have that conversation on their campus. So something like that is something that the Bakersfield community can do right away. I know, so it's not just faculty, also student government associations. I know Bakersfield SGA so gracefully hosted this event. So there's student government associations that are passing student resolutions calling for the mandatory teaching of issues around racial justice or even critical race theory at their institution. So it's not just the faculty that can pass a resolution like that. Students can pass a resolution like that as well.
I have an interesting question here in the chat. How do Hispanics fit into critical race theory?
There's an offshoot of critical race theory called LAT-CRIT, LATCRIT, which focuses specifically on issues of race as they impact the Latino community in the United States. I can also say, however, that most of the, I won't say most, but a large majority of the critical race theory scholars who have made major contributions to the field have been Latino. Ian Haney Lopez, IANHANEYLOPEZ, Ian Haney Lopez is one of the most prominent of those scholars. And his theories around racial formation helped us learn more about how the idea of race itself is not just a social construct, but also a legal construct. Mexicans were declared white, if you can believe that, by American courts, even though in American society they did not see them as white. So you know that was the type of thing that he discussed in his scholarship. He's also another scholar is Richard Delgado, RACHARD DLGADO. He and his wife Jean Stefancic have written some of the more prominent books on critical race theory. The critical race theory introductory book that most people read is written by Richard Delgado. He talked a lot in his scholarship about the use of narrative in the law and legal scholarship and how important that is to understanding the vagaries of racial injustice. The list goes on. So I in my critical race theory students, my critical race theory class this semester, I've got 4 or 5 Latino students. One is writing about her heritage as someone who on one side of her family has Mexican heritage, on the other side of her family has Puerto Rican heritage. And she discusses the different way those communities see race and the different ways they identify with their racial identity in the United States. I mean, I will stop there because as you can see, there's a lot I could say about that. But there's so many scholars who talk about that issue in the critical race theory field that it's, Tanya Hernandez at Fordham is another one who's talked about these issues. So it's really, the thing about critical race theory as a field is that it's sometimes flattened and discussed as if it is a field that looks at race through a black-white binary. That is incorrect. It does not look at race through a black-white binary. It's for me, is my formative way of understanding the many dynamics of race and racism and racial structures in the United States throughout society.
And then there's some resources in the chat. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosales, for those. And I have a couple questions that I'm going to kind of combine on having conversations on race and how people do it, at what level they do it, and about cross-racial dialogues and how to have those conversations, I guess I would say in the classroom as well as outside of the classroom. We recently had a racial climate survey at Bakersfield College. It was a nationwide survey, and it showed that those conversations are difficult or aren't happening, and the different ways that Black students, white students, Latinx students, and 2 or more races students experience the college. So any thoughts on how to have those conversations in the classroom or outside of the classroom? And from some of the emails that went back and forth, a lot of the professors see things very differently as well. So any suggestions on having those conversations?
Continue to have those conversations in different formats. Is the college in person, Dr. Parks, or are you still completely online?
We are in person and online and hybrid. We're about half and half right now.
Okay. I will say that I think it is very important for people to have face-to-face conversations, small group conversations, conversations where people can exchange each other's perspectives in an environment where there's openness and forgiveness and room for people to make mistakes and room for people to show emotions, and you can still move forward afterwards. Also, I think the benefit of being able to have these conversations on a college campus, as opposed to our failure to have that conversation on a national political level, is that you are in a very close-knit community. You know each other from class, you know each other from faculty meetings, you know each other from student government organizations. So what that does, I would hope, is provide you with a base understanding and level of trust to know that most of the people that are in the conversations are there from a perspective of goodwill, and they want to learn how to make the campus a better place, and everybody is trying to figure it out. And I think that's the best way to approach those conversations in small groups. Perhaps it can be small Zoom calls. And again, I from my perspective, I think a student government resolution, a faculty resolution, something that people can organize around to discuss so that there's an outcome that people are looking towards. I think that's a good platform. That's a good jumping off point to have those discussions, so people can really think about, wait a minute, what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? how will this make our community better? If our racial climate on campus is one that is, creating fear, or just creating a great deal of suffering for people, how do we actually solve this? And we are going to do something to solve it. Leaving it as is not an option. We're going to do something to solve it. So what should it be? So I would say commit to doing something, and have the conversations be driven by a discussion as to what exactly it is that this particular community wants to do going forward.
I want to get to the current events that we have in terms of Ahmaud Arbery, and you said the first trial was whitewashed, I saw in the paper.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the second one wasn't. So what comments do you have on that?
Well, to me, I thought I had brought that up in the presentation because just this week we saw the conviction of the McMichaels, of the killers of Ahmaud Arbery, for hate crime charges, separate from the murder charges that took place earlier. And I think many people were questioning what is the use of having a second trial when they've already been convicted for murder, implementing just a little bit of a harsher sentence, having them serve in a less luxurious prison, and going from federal to state, the federal to the state penitentiary. And what I wanted to make sure people recognize is that, similar to your discussion around climate, if there's a hate crime incident, of course, the Ahmaud Arbery incident is the worst possible incident of somebody being killed because of their race. But it could be something like graffiti, or something like a comment, or anything else that happens on campus. I think people forget that these crimes are not simply harmful to the individual who is victimized, but it changes the entire climate of the community, and fear ripples throughout the community. I know when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, I'm also, not young, I guess, a younger-ish Black man who likes to go jogging in his neighborhood. And my mother was scared to death. And she was definitely affected by the Ahmaud Arbery killing, and was harmed by that. And it was very, very scared for me to run. And, for many days and weeks tried to stop me from exercising. So I just wanted to use that example to show that small incidents that affect individual people can have ripple effects, especially when those incidents are incidents that are where people are targeted because of their identity. It can be a gender-based a crime, it can be a race-based crime. And so those hate crimes, whether the worst possible hate crime, like we saw with the Ahmaud Arbery case, and I don't know if anything like this has ever happened at Bakersfield, but if it's something like a graffiti issue or slur or something like that, those things need to be addressed as a community, and they need to be addressed not as individualized incidents where the only person who's harmed is the direct victim. The whole entire campus climate gets harmed. And when you see a campus climate where there is tension around race, oftentimes those tensions have been created by specific incidents that took place that were not addressed as community-wide concerns, but were instead addressed as individual concerns, with only the most immediate person who was harmed was the only person who deserves justice. Yes, so basically take the Ahmaud Arbery situation and apply it to our own context.
Right. That's very good, because people are continually re-traumatized as they hear about and as they see other instances, and as they're very aware that it could be them, or, in the case of your mother, or in the case of me, it could be my son, it could be my husband.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And people forget that. And I think acknowledging that is part of how you fix a racial climate. And failing to acknowledge that is why racial climates continue to go south.
Okay, I'm going to ask you 2 more questions.
Okay.
Can you clarify what you mean by racial project, and what role does the state play in making and unmaking race?
Great question. So racial project is a term from the scholarship on race, essentially articulating the fact that there are some things that happen in our society where there are racial disparities. There's some things where there are some phenomena, institutions, practices where those racial disparities are ongoing to the point where you have to conclude that those racial disparities are intended outcomes and are indeed projects that were always designed to have those disparate outcomes. So what I meant by the First Amendment as being a racial project was I look at the First Amendment as a amendment to the Constitution that provides public good. Like being able to speak freely is being given. You're being given something tangible and useful when you're given the right to free speech. But what we see in our study of history is that some have more free speech rights than others. I mean, we can see that on January 6th. But to understand that disparity in who's given more free speech and who's given less free speech there's always been that disparity, of course, going back to civil rights movement and before then, who had more rights to read, who had more right to speak, who had more right to protest. And it's a project that provides more to some and less to others on the grounds of race. And so that dissemination of the free speech good on racial grounds is a racial project. Other examples of racial project would be the criminal justice system. Another example, you could say immigration. These are projects where throughout history we have seen, if you look at the large scope of history, these institutions have created such disparities that they move from, it's not just coincidental that these disparities have taken place. It's like you're giving some more to some and less to others. And it's part of an ongoing project to do so. And that helps to shape our society in a certain way. And what was the second part of the question?
What role does the state play in making and unmaking race?
That's right. So the state has played a major role in making race, and specifically through the use of the law. The most easy to understand way that it's played a role in making race is through something like the census, where many people who are mixed race or people or something along those lines learn of their racial identity through looking at the census and having to check a box, certainly. But I mean, even before that, the idea of the one drop rule is something that the state conceived of. The determinations of what racial category people fit into based on, again, skin color has only been one factor. There are people who have, who are African-American or Black who have a lighter skin color than people who are Latino or white, if they're tanned or something like that. But then the decision to look at the grain of their hair, the shape of the nose, all these different biological measurements that, especially in the 19th century, were very much seen as an accurate way to determine race. A lot of those decisions were made and stamped and made into law by the courts or by laws that actually articulated that this is what it means to be Black, this is what it means to be white, this is what it means to be Asian, right? So the state played a major role in determining the biological understandings of race. And that's probably the easiest way to understand the role that the state has played in making race. there are other things that could be said as well in terms of race being understood as not just a biological condition, but also as a socioeconomic condition. You ask O.J. Simpson or somebody like that, are they, can somebody, be seen to live in a Black neighborhood, and this neighborhood may be determined that in the past it would have been redlining which determined it to be a Black neighborhood, and that the history and legacy of that space and the racing of that space would be then associated with crime and other things. But traditionally, race has been a phenomena where you attribute behavioral characteristics or moral characteristics to people based on their identity. And that identity can, of course, first and foremost, be their biological presentation, but sometimes it's also geography and the way they speak and other things like that.
Interesting. Yeah. My race is on my birth certificate, actually.
Yeah. I'll tell you one funny story. So when I traveled to Brazil a few years ago and I lost my passport and I had to go to the police station to get a new ID, and they asked me what race I was. I said I was Black, and they laughed and said, "No, you're not." In Brazil, they don't have just white and Black. They have many other different categorizations. They say you're actually Moreno, which is sort of like a brownish color. So you're not a Black person. You're a Moreno. I can't pronounce it correctly. And I was like, wait a minute, I've been Black my whole life. Of course, the police said, don't worry, we're doing you a favor. Is what they said to me. But the state, it just is a reminder that the government in Brazil has more racial categories than the government in the United States does. And so they could assign me, and that was my ID. I had a Moreno Brazilian government issued ID that I had to carry with me for the rest of my trip.
Wow. Okay, in 1 minute, I'm looking at the time. What are some of the other projects that you're working on at the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center?
Oh, well, thank you for asking that question. And so the Thurgood Marshall Center is working on a number of projects. I could even pull up our website really briefly. We only have 1 minute left, but if anyone is ever interested in being involved with any of the work that we're doing, please feel free to reach out. We file amicus briefs. We do projects on many different issues, including reparations. One of our major issues that we're focused on is reparations work. We have created an organization called the African American Redress Network along with Columbia University. And our work has involved working with local organizations and communities around the country that are grassroots driven initiatives to try to make reparations happen on the local level. You see that in all of these different places around the country, we've seen local reparations pushes maybe at the university level, at the city level. Many of you know about Evanston, Illinois, the first city in the country to pass a reparations ordinance. Georgetown in Washington, D.C. So many of these local communities are pushing for reparations, and we work to support those communities through legal work and advocacy support. So those are some of the projects we're working on. We're also big on supporting initiatives providing for mental health for African American community, and we are working with the Mike Brown Foundation to advocate for mental health resources to be given to parents of those killed by police brutality, just like Mike Brown's mother, who was a big advocate for that. So if anyone's ever interested in collaborating with us, please reach out. I'd love to have some partners out there on the West Coast.
Okay, great. And if you want to put your contact information in the chat, that would be great. And other people there was so many more questions, and I had more questions, but our time is up, and I really appreciate having this time to talk with you and get your perspectives and to share these questions as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you, and congratulations on your Hall of Fame induction.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, folks, thank you again so much for joining us today. We know that we had a plethora of questions, and Professor Hansford has shared his email with us. I mean, that's pretty epic. I know I'm going to go ahead and put that into my mailing address. So please, if you have any questions, you want to reach out, stay connected, utilize that. I know there were tons of questions that we couldn't get to, and we appreciate everybody's participation today. As a quick reminder, as we wrap up, the session has been recorded and will be available for 2 weeks on our BCSGA YouTube. Please find it there. There was so much to unpack. I know I need to go back and look at some of the slides that he shared with us today. So please know it'll be up for 2 weeks. If you have any students or anybody else who is struggling to find the link, please reach out to us at studentlife@bakersfieldcollege.edu. Happy to share the website with them so they can watch it at their own pace for the next 2 weeks. But otherwise, you can all find more information about our upcoming DSS speakers at bakersfieldcollege.edu/events/DSS. Otherwise, we thank you all so much for your time. You have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.